I'm Monica Montag. I'm founder and senior nutritionist at Be Well Associates. I founded Be Well 30 years ago in 1990 because I wanted to help people get healthy using diet and lifestyle interventions and supplements rather than sliding into all sorts of chronic and not so chronic illnesses. So today's topic is very timely. We're going to talk about diabetes and try to sort out what constitutes type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and then insulin resistance. But before we jump in, I wanted to let you know that fully 10.5% of the US population, as of statistics from last year, are considered diabetic. And 1/3 of the US population is actually in a state of pre-diabetes, meaning, and without realizing it. Unfortunately, the over 65 crowd ends up having about 25% of them are pre-diabetic and may or may not be aware of it. So that was one of my intentions today, is to help you evaluate whether you are at risk. So let's go to the first slide. So first of all, I want to kind of dispense with type 1 diabetes. That is a situation where the pancreas stops insulin production. It's usually very sudden. Oftentimes it's an emergency situation. This is often called juvenile diabetes. It does happen with children. And there are number of theories about what causes it, including that it's caused by a virus, or it's genetic, or it's an environmental trigger to a weak genetic link. But basically, it's considered an autoimmune condition where the body attacks itself, although our understanding of autoimmune is that the body attacks altered self, which is a whole other issue, which is not within the scope of today's discussion. But I just wanted to say type 1 is a very different kind of a diabetes than the one we're talking about today. So type 2 diabetes is a situation where long-term escalation in blood sugar causes the pancreas to shut down and stop manufacturing insulin. But this is usually happening over a long period of time. Some holistic doctors will identify it as being a 10 or 15-year process. Initially, the situation is managed with medications. Metformin is an old tried and true medication that's used for this. And basically what it does is helps the body use blood sugar more effectively. If nothing changes, so the person is continuing their lifestyle of eating lots of refined carbohydrates and high stress levels, and they're taking their metformin, but their blood sugar levels continue to climb and their insulin levels continue to decline, they will end up becoming insulin diabetic, an insulin dependent diabetic. So at that point, then they're taking shots, they're measuring their blood sugar. It's a pretty difficult disease and needs constant management. Before any of the type 2 diabetes symptoms enter, people spend quite a long time in a state of insulin resistance. And that is really what I want to talk about today, because that is the borderline state that can be reversed using diet, exercise, supplements, and some of the other things that we're going to talk about today. So what are some of the signs of insulin resistance? And by the way, there are other terms for this, including syndrome X and metabolic syndrome. They're all interchangeable. But basically, they are a set of symptoms and blood markers that identify that the person's blood sugar levels are increasing. So one of the first signs is abdominal obesity. And I will come back to that and explain why that is. But as far as lab work, one of your first tips that things are going in the wrong direction is when your blood work comes back with high LDL cholesterol. That's the cholesterol that is going out to your arteries from your liver, but most especially high triglycerides. And then to a lower extent, the low HDL cholesterol. That's the cholesterol coming back from the vessels back into the liver. So high triglycerides, and I'm not just talking about maintaining triglycerides of less than 150. I'm talking about your triglycerides. Triglyceride goal should be that it's half your total cholesterol. So if your cholesterol is 200, which is, you know, borderline normal, then your triglycerides should be no more than 100. Escalating fasting blood sugars and A1C. So frankly, the fasting blood sugar is not that useful a measure because any form of stress on your way to get the blood draw can increase your blood sugar. But what is more significant is the A1C. And the A1C represents your 3-month blood sugar average. So depending on which lab you're using, the high end can be anywhere from 5.6 to 6. So in other words, a fasting blood sugar level of less than 5.6 or 6 is what you're looking for. And generally speaking, the lower your A1C, the better. The other thing that is part of this triad of symptoms that suggests that you're developing insulin resistance is escalating blood pressure. So there are lots of people out there who have always run very low levels of blood pressure, and suddenly their blood pressure is creeping up, although it is still within normal range. Well, that is still significant. Just because you meet the numbers doesn't mean that your blood pressure is, you know, normal with this context in mind. Another thing that can happen with insulin resistance is hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar. Carbohydrate addiction, so this is having chronic cravings for sugar, are part of the picture. Having insomnia that's relieved by a snack. So if you're somebody that gets up in the middle of the night and you can't go back to sleep until you've had a bowl of cereal, then this might be a clue that you are developing insulin resistance. PCOS, which is becoming more and more common, especially among the young women in our culture. It's polycystic ovarian syndrome. So it's having cysts on the ovaries. And then hirsutism. And hirsutism means having body hair in inappropriate places. This mostly applies to women. So we all have a good understanding, right, that carbohydrates, especially simple carbs, cause diabetes and earlier on insulin resistance. But I really want to highlight to you the effect of stress, chronic stress, on developing insulin resistance and then moving into diabetes. So I just wrote down a quick continuum of symptoms that we experience when we perceive a threat to our well-being. And the first thing that happens is our adrenaline and cortisol levels go up, and our body gets into a state of hyperarousal so that we can fight or flee. And guess what we need in order to fuel those muscles so that we can get away or fight? We need blood sugar, right? And so that's one of the things that automatically gets secreted by the liver in order to help us with the stress response. So the stress response was only ever intended to be of short duration to get us out of a dangerous situation. Unfortunately, modern life has people in a state of fight or flight 24/7, and that's when we run into trouble. So what can you do about preventing diabetes? Well, we're going to talk about a few tips on eating well and balancing body chemistry. We'll talk about a handful of supplements that are particularly beneficial when it comes to correcting insulin resistance. We'll just touch on the role of exercise and also just mention the role of the body-mind because of this connection between stress and high blood sugars. So let's start out by talking about diet. And still to this day, after all the education that we've had out there, think about the standard American breakfast. Oh my gosh, it is a recipe for diabetes. All those sweets, and whether it be in the form of a quote unquote healthy muffin, which, you know, most muffins are about 600 calories and 80 grams worth of simple carbs, or sugar sprinkled cereal, you know, donuts, toast, French toast, all those things, just way too much sugar, way too many carbs. So that the normal blood sugar response isn't common for most people. So in this illustration, the next slide, please, we see that a complex carbohydrate in this case is eaten at noon. And what happens is if you've eaten enough of that complex carb, then you have a nice increase in your blood sugar about 2 hours later, 2 to 3 hours later. And then there's a nice steady curve and 5 hours later, you're ready to refuel. And that's because you have used up the carbs for energy and you're using it appropriately. In contrast, when you eat something that's simple, that's a simple carbohydrate, meaning it's processed and it's, you know, usually white flour, white sugar, white rice, anything that comes in a package as a quick food, a quick pick-me-up. You have this very high spike in blood sugar just an hour to an hour and a half after you've eaten the food, and then there's a crash usually about 2 hours later, where your blood sugar goes lower than it was before you ate the snack. So it sort of defeats the purpose to be eating something sweet for energy, because actually it's going to provide you with less energy within 2 hours of eating it. And some of the symptoms of hypoglycemia, just in case you all are unfamiliar with it, are represented in this little cartoon. And keep in mind that you can have hypoglycemia symptoms 5 hours after you've eaten, but that's because your blood sugar has declined as a natural process of using up the fuel that was available to you. This is different. This is having these kinds of symptoms an hour and a half to 2 hours after you've eaten something that's too simple. And then the third possible blood sugar response is hyperglycemia, where you've gone ahead and eaten complex carbs, but your body is just not able to use it. And so your blood sugar stays high for hours and hours and hours. And of course, the main symptom of that is that your A1C will be elevated. But along with it, some people have frequent urination, thirst, nausea, fatigue, shortness of breath, fruity breath, headache, and dry mouth. So let's talk about what the mechanism is by which we get blood sugar into the cell, because this is super important to understand. And this diagram comes from the work of Diana Schwartzbein, who is an endocrinologist in Santa Barbara, California. And I think this is one of the most brilliant representations of this process. So every cell wall has receptor sites, and think of them as doors. And those doors open in response to insulin, which I don't know if you can see the little key marked insulin in the far right side of this picture. Thanks, Annie. So insulin is the key that unlocks the door of these receptor sites on the cell so that the sugar molecules that are in the bloodstream can go into the cell and provide energy and thereby help you use up your blood sugar. So everything is hunky-dory. Well, what happens if there is not only a great deal of carbohydrate consumption for years and years and years, but also remember lots of stress over the years can also cause these cell walls to become completely plastered with sugar, with glucose, and pretty soon the cell walls are not responding to insulin. So a couple things happen. One, people put on abdominal fat. Remember, I mentioned that as the first sign of insulin resistance. The reason for that is because insulin is a fat storage hormone. So if you have insulin sitting there in the bloodstream and the cell is not responding to it, then the insulin levels will go up and send the message back to the pancreas to tell the pancreas, hey, we have plenty of insulin here. We don't need any more. So over time, the pancreas makes less and less and less insulin. But for many years, that person is going to have high levels of insulin as a red flag that insulin, the insulin-pancreas relationship is starting to change. So then in the final representation of this series of slides, what we see is that the cells are completely unwilling to respond to insulin. And so the sugar molecules just stay in the bloodstream. None of the sugar goes into the cell, therefore the person is exhausted, and everything they put into their mouth ends up on their hips or their waist. So then in that situation, you're in a full-blown state of insulin resistance. And the goal is to resensitize the cell walls so that you can get those blood sugar molecules in through those receptor sites again so that you can produce energy inside of the cell and use up your blood sugar. So how do we do that? How do we reverse insulin resistance? Well, some basic principles of managing blood sugar is to be eating quality protein with each meal. And by that, I mean, you know, as far as expensive a protein source as you can afford in terms of free-range meat and eggs and poultry and cold water fish and organic legumes such as soy. Limiting your complex carbs, so eliminating simple carbs, okay, that goes without saying, but even managing your complex carbs, so these would primarily be vegetable based, should be no more than 75 to 125 grams per day, and of course that depends on your A1C and also your body size. So this is where you would have to work with a nutritionist to get the specifics of that. Make sure you get 30 grams of fiber per day in the form of mostly vegetables, minimal whole grains, and limited fruit. Because fruit is sugar. So there are low glycemic fruits that are better than others, such as the berries and Granny Smith apples, for example, are your better choices. Healthy fats become very important. because fats help to change the cell walls from their impermeable state to returning to becoming permeable. And you need those cell walls to be permeable so that you can get the glucose moving through them. So a higher fat diet, and you'll see in a minute, another reason why that's so important, is very critical for reversing insulin resistance. Generally speaking, the Mediterranean diet is a good choice if you're looking to follow a specific diet, but of course limiting the carbs and converting all of the pasta recommendations into vegetable sources, such as using spaghetti squash instead of pasta. So I want to take a moment to go over this glycemic index, because this is where you get some concrete numbers about what constitutes a complex carb versus a simple carb. And you might be shocked to find out that carrots have a higher glycemic value than honey. In other words, carrots turn to sugar more quickly than honey or potato. I know, shocking, right? So the idea of having a bag of baby carrots as your snack is really not going to support your goals to decrease your blood sugar. Now, it is true that cooked carrots, glycemic index drops significantly. It's one of those foods that becomes a complex carb once it's cooked. Tomatoes are the same, although tomatoes have a low glycemic index. So, as I always like to point out, especially if you're having a snack on an empty stomach where it's going to have a immediate and dramatic impact on your blood sugar, it's actually better to choose ice cream, which has a low glycemic index of 36, versus carrots at 92. So don't say your nutritionist told you that ice cream was bad. It has its place. Okay, so getting back to the American breakfast, how do we incorporate the information that we just learned about complex carbs, proteins, healthy fat, limiting the high glycemic carbohydrates into an actual breakfast menu? So one of the easiest things to do, unless you have an egg allergy, is to have an omelet with lots and lots of vegetables in it and perhaps a half cup of berries. Another possibility is some Greek yogurt, which is not only high in protein, but it's also high in fat. And you can add some low glycemic raspberries and some flaxseed or chia seeds for fiber. I wanted to mention here that fat is your friend when you're dealing with reversing insulin resistance, because the glycemic value of fat is 0. So any food that you add fat to, a high glycemic food that you add fat to, will actually come down on that glycemic index, meaning that it will have less of an abrupt effect on your blood sugar. So that's why I'm pointing out that when you choose the yogurt, use the whole fat yogurt and not a low fat yogurt. And then kale and tofu omelet with some chicken sausage is a great choice for someone who has an egg allergy, which we often identify in our food testing, and something that people may not actually be aware of having. And I just want to throw in a comment here that there are certain kinds of antibodies that we form when our gut health has declined, and we develop something called leaky gut. Often leads to IgG food reactions, which people don't realize they have because they are not having any kind of skin breakout or digestive distress from these foods. But what those foods cause is a spike in blood sugar. So if you're someone with a hidden egg allergy and you're having eggs every morning because you know that's good for the insulin resistance, it actually may not be that great for you. So this is where doing a little bit of testing, nutritional testing, can be so helpful, is to get that piece of the puzzle figured out, so that you do a very thorough job of evaluating what's good for you to eat and what's going to work against you in reversing the insulin resistance. Okay, let's move on and talk about supplements for insulin resistance. So the primary goal of reversing insulin resistance is to resensitize the cell wall to sugar, to blood sugar, okay? And we already talked about fish oil. Sorry, we didn't talk about it, but I mentioned that the omega-3 fatty acids are very important for making the cells more permeable. And so fish oil is part of every program that we put people on to reverse their insulin resistance. And I should have had that on this slide, so we will add that. But chromium, vanadium are two trace minerals that literally escort the glucose cell through the cell membrane and into the cell. It's particularly potent when it's coupled with biotin and zinc. And one of my favorite products to use for people that are dealing with insulin resistance is a product called Chromium Synergy that is actually packaged. Those nutrients, chromium, vanadium, biotin, and zinc, are packaged in a cinnamon base. And we know that cinnamon is also very effective in reversing insulin resistance. So I'm a big fan of that product. Lipoic acid also helps to resensitize the cell wall to insulin, and thereby helps us to use up our blood sugar. The other thing I love about lipoic acid is that it recycles all of our antioxidants. And especially these days, we need as much antioxidant protection as we can possibly get. Magnesium, a lot of people that are in a pre-diabetic state are very low in magnesium stores. And magnesium is really important for producing ATP energy. It also relaxes the muscles. It's very, very stripped in our food supply. So most people need it as a supplement to some degree. Berberine also helps to resensitize the cell walls. It also acts as an antimicrobial. This is one of the reasons why I love using nutrients to help people with various health issues, because most of these vitamins, minerals, and herbs are multifactorial. So in other words, they will help you in many ways, not just one way, which is unlike medication, right? So you take metformin, it resensitizes the cell wall, your blood sugar comes down. But does it also act like an antimicrobial? Is it also boosting your immune system? Is it also helping you with hair, skin, and nails? So you kind of get what I'm driving at, right? We also have a really great multivitamin that I like the formula a lot, because it includes everything that's on this list except berberine and cinnamon. It's called Metabolic Synergy, and it's usually our go-to for people who are in this state of insulin resistance. Okay, next slide. So, role of exercise, of course, is to improve insulin sensitivity, and by using up using your muscles, you're lowering blood sugar naturally because you're producing energy. And some of the best practices for exercise for this purpose are to do interval walking, which is easy on the joints. You walk, basically it's easy. You walk as fast as possible for a minute or two and then recover for 4 minutes and repeat that at least 7 times, but you can do it more. The reason I like this particular exercise is that it doesn't require equipment, and it also gets you outside, and there are just so many stress relieving benefits of being in nature. At the bare minimum, focus on elevating your heart rate by 50% for half an hour, 3 times a week. Try to include some weightlifting to increase your lean body mass. And, you know, having good muscle mass not only helps you to burn calories, but it's one of the best markers for healthy aging is good body mass. So getting back to the stress aspect of managing blood sugar, remember how we talked about stress being such a huge influence. So this is seriously just as important as any of the nutritional interventions that you might incorporate. Having a daily meditation or prayer practice, it doesn't have to be long, it could be 5 or 10 minutes, can have a noticeable impact on your reactivity during the day. And really, it's not that you're trying to control the stressors around you. What you are working to control is your reaction to those stressors. And by minimizing those or reacting in a healthy way, you are sparing your own physiology as well as your nervous system, of course. Yoga and stretching are also very important. And some form of mind-body technique to further assist with decreasing reactivity during these stressful times, such as biofeedback tapping and EMDR. And finally, you know, one of the things that fascinated me the most when I became introduced to the field of holistic health was the connection between the mind and the body, and how the body speaks when the mind sometimes doesn't want to face something or admit an issue. So Louise Hay, who was one of the pioneers in mind-body medicine and just died just a few years ago, she identified diabetes as being a longing for what might have been, or a deep sorrow, feeling like you have no sweetness left in life. And of course, that's a choice we all make. And she was very promoted affirmations as ways to retrain the brain, and the affirmation to reverse those feelings is written here. This moment is filled with joy. I now choose to experience the sweetness of today. So in working with your healthcare team, if you're concerned that you may be heading towards insulin resistance or are in insulin resistance and worried about heading towards type 2 diabetes, and your doctors, you know, they'll readily measure your lipids, your cholesterol levels, and they'll take your blood pressure, but most of them will balk at doing an A1C. If they're not willing to measure an A1C for you, there are actually now kits that you can buy in which you measure your own. But these are the top 3 blood tests, in addition to lipids and, of course, blood pressure, that would help you identify whether insulin resistance is a thing for you. So ask for your A1C, a fasting insulin, and vitamin D. And by the way, the vitamin D should be a normal level is between 60 and 80 nanograms per milliliter. Do not accept 30 as being normal, because vitamin D is so important for metabolism, for immune system, for bone building, for brain. It's really actually a pro-hormone and not even a vitamin. So just to recap, we have covered very quickly 4 lifestyle strategies to prevent diabetes that include eating well and balancing your body chemistry, smart supplements to ward off and correct insulin resistance. And those of you that have worked with us in the past know that we do nutritional testing to identify which nutrients you may be short in, and that helps to balance body chemistry. The role of exercise and tending to the body-mind to lower stress and affirm vibrant health. And these days, I'm sure that you are all aware that being in a state of prediabetes or being diabetic is an actual risk factor for any kind of an infection. So the stakes for being healthy and staying healthy are higher than ever. So I think now we're going to turn it over back to Annie for Q&A, right? If you have some questions.
Great. So if anybody has a question, just click the chat, or you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it. And we have also some questions that people have asked in advance that we're going to definitely go over.
Okay. So go ahead and.
Anybody want to unmute themselves and ask a question?
I have a question.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me? Okay. How long does it take to undo this? And I mean, I understand everyone's different, but if you really turned your eating around,
Yeah. One of the most dramatic cases I had was a 50-something-year-old gentleman from the Bedford area a couple of years ago. And he took his A1C from 6.8 to 5.8 in 3 months.
Okay.
Just by making the changes in diet, adding a few of the supplements that I had recommended. We did do testing. We did identify, actually, funny thing, an egg allergy for him. Took eggs out of the diet, and he's been healthy ever since, maintaining his A1C. Actually, it's come down a little bit more even. I think it's at 5.4 in the last couple of years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get the feeling that it's too late, you know?
No, it's never too late. Even when if you are already on metformin, I would say once you are taking insulin shots, I don't feel like I could work with you then. But if it's just short of insulin and you're on metformin and some of the other medications that are being used now, we can definitely reverse and work with you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So let's go to one of our questions in advance. Monica, you spoke to this a little bit, but someone had asked, what are the signs on the blood work that I might be developing type 2 diabetes?
Well, triglycerides that are more than half of your total cholesterol.
Okay.
Blood pressure that is increased over what it normally is. So even if it's still considered in normal range, but it's high for you, I would pay attention to that. An A1C of over 5.6.
Anything else?
Well, you know, if you don't have an A1C, but your glucose is over 99, that might be cause for concern. But like I said, that could just be an artifact. A high fasting glucose can just be caused by any kind of stressor that you encountered on the way to the lab, including if you're somebody that dreads having a blood draw. That could raise your blood sugar. So that's why those single glucose numbers are just not that helpful.
Right. So Monica, you've talked about a lot of things to do. If you could pick the top 3 actions that you would suggest to people for reversing high blood sugar, what would those top 3 things be?
Okay. I would stop eating sugar. I would exercise regularly and take some sort of supplement combination that helps to resensitize the cell walls to glucose. But I'll tell you something, it's not the kind of condition. I mean, I know we want to pare everything down to, oh, I just need 2 tips, or I'm just going to do 3 tips. No, this is a little complicated, and you know, it's going to take more of an effort early on to get things turned around.
Yes.
I don't know if 3 is going to do it, because I'm thinking, well, what about fish oil? You know, you need fish oil unless you're willing to eat fish every day, which is a really great solution if you can do it.
Right. Okay, so this is from Bob's laptop. I eat shredded wheat for breakfast, 48 grams of carbs, 8 grams of fiber, and 0 sugars, along with 7 grams of protein with some blueberries and skim milk. Is that a healthy breakfast? My A1C is 5.9.
Not for you, Bob, because think about it. The skim milk and the blueberries are more carbs. There's a little bit of protein in the milk, but you know, you should be confining your carbs. I don't know what your body size is, but you should be on the lower end of that recommendation that I made earlier for carbs, and your breakfast should be close to 21 grams of protein. So, you know, for most adults, 150 pounds, a realistic minimal protein intake is about 75 grams a day. Okay, so 150-pound adult, about 75 grams of protein a day, divided into 3 or 4 portions, meals.
Okay, from Anne Greeley. Can I take chromium synergy and metabolic synergy and fish oil and another multi, or is that too much?
The chromium synergy plus the metabolic synergy is a great idea because it further, you know, increases the impact of the getting your blood sugar into the cell. You would not need another multivitamin, and the fish oil is also a good idea. So I usually tell people to take the fish oil with their 2 largest meals of the day, and then the chromium plus the metabolic synergy with each meal.
Okay, can you say that one more time for people, Monica?
Sure. So if you're using these particular products, then it's best to use the metabolic synergy and the chromium synergy with each meal, okay? And the fish oil with your 2 biggest meals of the day.
Okay, great.
And of course, you'd still be restricting carbs and making sure you have enough protein.
Great. Another question that we have in advance is just a little bit more of an explanation of how stress contributes to the development of type 2 diabetes.
Well, I feel like it's pretty straightforward. When you perceive a threat, or you find yourself, you know, starting to get wound up, or actually some people are so used to being in a state of fight or flight that to them it's normal, and they don't realize that that's where they are. But so even without eating anything, your liver will produce blood sugar in order to fuel the muscles so that you can fight or flee. And so if you are not having a physical outlet for that stress response where you use up your blood sugar through exercise, then it's just sitting there in your bloodstream, coating your cell walls. And if that's going on day in and day out, week in and week out, month in and month out, years and years and years in a row, you end up with the situation that was in that little schematic where the cell wall is plastered with blood sugar and the cell is not able to receive it. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Any other questions that anybody has?
I have one, Monica, about gluten-free bread.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of carb. Now,
Yeah.
I typically use one that is whole grain and 4 grams of fiber.
Yes.
Could you also speak to what's too much in a day and if the fiber is high enough in terms of carbs?
Well, typical daily goal for fiber is about 30 grams a day. And of course, having fiber with your meals will also slow down the absorption of glucose and help you keep your blood sugar steady.
Okay, and
Okay.
so it's just a matter of looking at the numbers in terms of, as you said, 30 grams a day.
Yes.
Because I think sometimes I'm eating too much bread in terms of balance of other complex carbohydrates, even though.
Yes, it's very possible. And I know, I happen to know, Paula, that you're an O blood type. And so for you, your carbs should come primarily from vegetables. That would be better for you.
Okay, rather than the grains.
Yeah, rather than the grain. So not to say that you shouldn't have any bread, but I probably wouldn't do more than 2 slices a day.
Yes, I try to keep it to that, and I was wondering.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay,
and if you look on our website, we have a blog under constipation, which gives you a brief list of fiber content of various foods as a reference to kind of eyeball how much fiber you're getting.
Okay, thank you. That's great.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Also, I just want to chime in that there's also a blog post about the various blood types and what diets go with them, if your interest has been piqued on that.
Thanks, Annie. Yep, we have so many blogs actually about this topic and related topics.
Great. Any last questions?
Well, I thank you all for taking the time on this beautiful morning to join us.
Sandy, do you have
I have a real quick question. Monica, you had mentioned a supplement that contained, it was on the one slide that contained most of those things needed.
The metabolic synergy. Yeah, the metabolic synergy. Yes, that would be a good multi. Yes.
Okay, so if you know that you have this insulin resistance, and clearly I do, that I should add into the mix?
You would replace your multi with it. It is a multi.
Okay, so that would make sense to do that, I think.
Yeah, I think
the more things I can put into motion to get this turned around, the better. Okay,
yes,
that sounds good. All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And I know many of you are probably already working with Monica or Mary, our other nutritionist, or our other Monica. And but if you'd like to book a free 15-minute phone consultation to discuss this in particular, please feel free to do that. Please also check out our the blog on BeWellAssociates.com for lots of great information. And if you have questions, you can email our front desk, bewell@bewellassociates.com, and be referred to Monica or Mary or our other Monica, and you know, be set up for perhaps a 15-minute consultation, or if maybe you need 30 minutes or whatever kind of session you need, because while Monica has given all these great general tips, we want to be sure that you're getting the individualized attention that you need.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a great
Bye
day
now.
today.
You as well.
Bye.